we're finding these lumps of reducibility that we can kind of attach ourselves to, and about which we can kind of have fairly simple narrative things to say. Because in principle, I say, what's going to happen in the next few seconds? Oh, there are these molecules moving around in the air in this room, and oh gosh, it's an incredibly complicated story. And that's a whole computationally irreducible thing, most of which I don't care about.
Mhm.
And most of it is, well, the air's still going to be here and nothing much is going to be different about it. And that's a kind of reducible fact about what is ultimately, at an underlying level, a computationally irreducible process.
And life would not be possible if we didn't have a large number of such reducible pockets,
Yes.
pockets amenable to reduction into something symbolic.
Yes, I think so. I
That
mean, life in the way that we experience it, that, I mean, one might, depending on what we mean by life, so to speak, the experience that we have of sort of consistent things happening in the world, the idea of space, for example, where there's, we can just say, you're here, you move there. It's kind of the same thing. It's still you in that different place, even though you're made of different atoms of space and so on. This is this idea that that there's sort of this level of predictability of what's going on. That's us finding a slice of reducibility in what is underneath this computationally irreducible kind of system. And I think that's sort of the thing which is actually my favorite discovery of the last few years is the realization that it is sort of the interaction between this sort of underlying computational irreducibility and our nature as kind of observers who sort of have to key into computational reducibility.
Mhm.
That fact leads to the main laws of physics that we discovered in the 20th century. So this is, we talk about this in more detail, but this is to me, it's kind of our nature as observers, the fact that we are computationally bounded observers. We don't get to follow all those little pieces of computational irreducibility to stuff what is out there in the world into our minds requires that we are looking at things that are reducible. We are compressing,
Mm.
kind of, we're extracting just some essence, some kind of symbolic essence of what's the detail of what's going on in the world. That, together with one other condition that at first seems sort of trivial, but isn't, which is that we believe we are persistent in time. That is, um,
Yes.
you know,
So some sense of causality.
here's the thing. At every moment, according to our theory, we're made of different atoms of space. At every moment, sort of the microscopic detail of what the universe is made of is being rewritten.
Mhm.
And in fact, the very fact that there's coherence between different parts of space is a consequence of the fact that there are all these little processes going on that kind of knit together the structure of space. It's kind of like if you wanted to have a fluid with a bunch of molecules in it, if those molecules weren't interacting, you wouldn't have this fluid that would pour and do all these kinds of things. It would just be sort of a free floating collection of molecules.
Mhm.
So similarly it is with space, that the fact that space is kind of knitted together is a consequence of all this activity in space. And the fact that kind of what we consist of, sort of this
Quality into some that kind of temporal
yes,
consistency is just a nice narrative to
right.
tell ourselves.
Well, the fact is, I think it's critical to the way we humans typically operate is that we have this single thread of experience. If you imagine sort of a mind where you have, maybe that's what's happening in various kinds of minds that aren't working the same way other minds work, is that you're splitting into multiple threads of experience. It's also it's also something where, when you look at, I don't know, quantum mechanics, for example, in the insides of quantum mechanics, it's splitting into many threads of experience. But in order for us humans to interact with it, you kind of have to knit all those different threads together so that we say, "Oh yeah, a definite thing happened, and now the next definite thing happens," and so on. And I think sort of inside, it's sort of interesting to try and imagine what's it like to have kind of these fundamentally multiple threads of experience going on. I mean, right now, different human minds have different threads of experience. We just have a bunch of minds that are interacting with each other, but we don't have within each mind, there's a single thread. And that is indeed a simplification. I think it's a thing, the general computational system does not have that simplification.
Mhm.
And it's one of the things, people often seem to think that, consciousness is the highest level of kind of things that can happen in the universe, so to speak. But I think that's not true. I think it's actually a, a specialization in which, among other things, you have this idea of a single thread of experience, which is not a general feature of anything that could kind of computationally happen in the universe.
So it's a feature of a computationally limited system that's only able to observe uh, reducible pockets. So,
Yeah,
so I mean, this word observer, it means something in quantum mechanics. It means something in a lot of places. It means something to us humans
right.
as conscious beings. So, what's the importance of the observer? What is the observer, and what's the importance of the observer in the computational universe?
So this question of what is an observer, what's the general idea of an observer, is actually one of my next projects, which
Mhm.
got somewhat derailed by the current sort of AI mania. But
Is there a connection there, or is that do you think the observer is primarily a physics phenomena?
is it related to the whole AI thing?
Yes.
Yes, it is related. So one question is, what is a general observer?
Mhm.
So, we have an idea what is a general computational system. We think about Turing machines, we think about other models of computation. There's a question, what is a general model of an observer? And there's kind of observers like us, which is kind of the observers we're interested in.
Yeah.
We could imagine an alien observer that deals with computational irreducibility and it has a mind that's utterly different from ours and completely incoherent with what we're like. But the fact is that if we are talking about observers like us, that one of the key things is this idea of kind of taking all the detail of the world and being able to stuff it into a mind,
Mhm.
being able to take all the detail and kind of extract out of it a smaller set of kind of degrees of freedom, a smaller number of elements that will sort of fit in our minds. And I think this question, so I've been interested in trying to characterize what is the general observer. And the general observer is, I think, in part, there are many. Let me give an example of
Mhm.
you have a gas, it's got a bunch of molecules bouncing around, and the thing you're measuring about the gas is its pressure.
Mhm.
And the only thing you as an observer care about is pressure. And that means you have a piston on the side of this box, and the piston is being pushed by the gas. And there are many, many different ways that molecules can hit that piston.
Mm.
But all that matters is the kind of aggregate of all those molecular impacts, because that's what determines pressure.
Mhm.
So there's a huge number of different configurations of the gas, which are all equivalent. So I think one key aspect of observers is this equivalencing of many different configurations of a system, saying all I care about is this aggregate feature. All I care about is this overall thing. And that's sort of one aspect. And we see that in lots of different. Again, it's the same story over and over again. That there's a lot of detail in the world, but what we are extracting from it is something, a sort of a thin summary of that detail.
Is that thin summary nevertheless true? Can it be a crappy approximation
Sure,
that on average is correct? I mean, if we look at the observer that's the human mind, it seems like there's a lot of very as represented by natural language, for example, there's a lot of really crappy approximation.
sure.
And that could be maybe a feature of it,
Well,
that there's
yes, but
ambiguity.
right, right. You don't know. It could be the case. You're just measuring the aggregate impacts of these molecules, but there is some tiny, tiny probability that these molecules will arrange themselves in some really funky way, and that just measuring that average isn't going to be the main point.
Yeah.
By the way, an awful lot of science is very confused about this because you look at papers and people are really keen. They draw this curve and they have these bars on the curve and things.
Yeah.
And it's just this curve, and it's this one thing, and it's supposed to represent some system that has all kinds of details in it. And this is a way that lots of science has gotten wrong because people say, I remember years ago I was studying snowflake growth. You have the snowflake and it's growing, it has all these arms, it's doing complicated things. But there was a literature on this stuff and it talked about, what's the rate of snowflake growth? And, it got pretty good answers for the rate of the growth of the
Mm.
snowflake. And then I looked at it more carefully, and they had these nice curves of, snowflake growth rates and so on. I looked at it more carefully, and I realized, according to their models, the snowflake will be spherical.
Mhm.
And so they got the growth rate right, but the detail was just utterly wrong. And not only the detail, the whole thing was not capturing. It was capturing this aspect of the system that was, in a sense, missing the main point of what was going on. And
What is the geometric shape of a snowflake?
Snowflakes start in the phase of water that's relevant
Yeah.
to the formation of snowflakes. It's a phase of ice which starts with a hexagonal arrangement of water molecules.
Hmm.
And so it starts off growing as a hexagonal plate. And then what happens is
So it's a
it's
plate. Oh, versus sphere
well,
versus
no,
plate.
but it's much more than that. I mean,
Yeah.
snowflakes are fluffy. Typical snowflakes have little dendritic arms.
Okay. Yeah.
And what actually happens is it's kind of cool because you can make these very simple discrete models with cellular automata and things that figure this out. You start off with this, hexagonal thing, and then the places it starts to grow little arms, and every time a little piece of ice adds itself to the snowflake,
Hmm.
the fact that that ice condensed from the water vapor heats the snowflake up locally, and so it makes it less likely for another piece of ice to accumulate right nearby. So this leads to a kind of growth inhibition. So you grow an arm, and it is a separated arm because right around the arm it got a little bit hot and it didn't add more ice there. So what happens is it grows, you have a hexagon, it grows out arms, the arms grow arms, and then the arms grow arms grow arms. And eventually, actually, it's kind of cool because it actually fills in another hexagon, a bigger hexagon. And when I first looked at this, I had a very simple model for this. I realized, when it fills in that hexagon, it actually leaves some holes behind. So I thought, well, that really right? So I look at these pictures of snowflakes, and sure enough, they have these little holes in them that are kind of scars of the way that these arms grow out.
Hmm. So
But
you can't fill in backfill holes. So it
they
just
don't
keeps going
backfill.
out.
Yeah, they don't backfill.
And presumably there's a limitation of how big, like you can't arbitrarily grow.
I'm not sure. I mean, the thing falls through I mean, I think it does, it hits
That's
the
it.
ground at some point. I
Oh,
think
I
you can
see.
grow, I think you can grow in the lab. I think you can grow pretty big ones. I think you can grow many, many iterations of this kind of goes from hexagon, it grows out arms, it turns back, it fills back into a hexagon, it grows more arms again.
In 3D.
No, it's flat usually.
Boy, why is it flat? Why doesn't it span out? Okay, okay, okay. Wait a minute. You said it's fluffy, and fluffy is a three-dimensional property, no? Or
No, it's fluffy. Snow is okay. So what makes we're really in a
that snowflake is not fluffy,
no,
or
no,
is
a
it?
single snowflake is fluffy.
Mhm,
And what happens is, if you have snow that is just pure hexagons,
mhm,
they can, they fit together pretty well. It doesn't have a lot of air in it.
mhm.
And they can also slide against each other pretty easily. And so the snow can be pretty, can I think avalanches happen sometimes when the things tend to be these, hexagonal plates and it kind of slides. But then when the thing has all these arms that have grown out, they don't fit together very well. And that's why the snow has lots of air in it. And if you look at one of these snowflakes, if you catch one, you'll see it has these little arms. And people often say, no two snowflakes are alike. That's mostly because as a snowflake grows, they do grow pretty consistently with these different arms and so on, but you capture them at different times as they fell through the air in a different way. You'll catch this one at this stage, and as it goes through different stages, they look really different. And so that's why kind of looks like no two snowflakes are alike because you caught them at different times.
So the rules under which they grow are the same. It's just
Yes,
the timing is
yes.
okay. So the point is, science is not able to describe the full complexity of snowflake growth.
Well, science, if you do what people might often do, which is say, okay, let's make it scientific, let's turn it into one number.
Mhm.
And that one number is kind of the growth rate of the arms or some such other thing. That fails to capture sort of the detail of what's going on inside the system. And that's in a sense a big challenge for science is how do you extract from the natural world, for example, those aspects of it that you are interested in talking about. Now, you
Yeah.
might just say, I don't really care about the fluffiness of the snowflakes. All I care about is the growth rate of the arms, in which case, you can have a good model without knowing anything about the fluffiness. But the fact is, as a practical, if you say what is the most obvious feature of a snowflake? Oh, that it has this complicated shape. Well, then you've got a different story about what you model. I mean, this is one of the features of sort of modeling in science. That what is a model? A model is some way of reducing the actuality of the world to something where you can readily sort of give a narrative for what's happening, where you can basically make some kind of abstraction of what's happening and answer questions that you care about answering. If you wanted to answer all possible questions about the system, you'd have to have the whole system
Hmm.
because you might care about this particular molecule. Where did it go? And your model, which is some big abstraction of that, has nothing to say about that. So, one of the things that's often confusing in science is people will have, I've got a model, somebody says. Somebody else will say, I don't believe in your model because it doesn't capture the feature of the system that I care about. There's always this controversy about, is it a correct model? Well, no model except for the actual system itself, is a correct model in the sense that it captures everything. The question is, does it capture what you care about capturing? Sometimes that's ultimately defined by what you're going to build technology out of, things like this. The one counterexample to this is if you think you're modeling the whole universe all the way down, then there is a notion of a correct model. But even that is more complicated because it depends on kind of how observers sample things and so on. That's a separate story. But at least at the first level, to say, this thing about, oh, it's an approximation, you're capturing one aspect, you're not capturing other aspects. When you really think you have a complete model for the whole universe, you better be capturing ultimately everything, even though to actually run that model is impossible because of computational irreducibility. The only thing that successfully runs that model is the actual running of the universe.
Is the universe itself. But okay, so what you care about is an interesting concept. So that's a human concept. So that's what you're doing with Wolfram Alpha and Wolfram language. Is you're trying to come up with symbolic representations possible. So a model that's as simple as possible that fully captures stuff we care about.
Yes. So, I mean, for example, we we'll have a thing about, data about movies, let's
Mhm.
say. We could be describing every individual pixel in every movie and so on, but that's not the level that people care about. And it's, yes, this is I mean, and that level that people care about is somewhat related to what's described in natural language.
Mhm.
But what we're trying to do is to find a way to sort of represent precisely so you can compute things. See, one thing when you say you give a piece of natural language, question is you feed it to a computer. You say, does the computer understand this natural language? Well, the computer processes it in some way. It does this. Maybe it can make a continuation of the natural language. Maybe it can go on from the prompt and say what it's going to say. You say, does it really understand it? Hard to know. But for in this kind of computational world, there is a very definite definition of does it understand, which is could it be turned into this symbolic computational thing from which you can compute all kinds of consequences?
Mhm.
And that's the sense in which one has sort of a target for the understanding of natural language. And that's kind of our goal is to have as much as possible about the world that can be computed in a reasonable way, so to speak, be able to be sort of captured by this kind of computational language. That's kind of the goal. And I think for us humans, the main thing that's important is as we formalize what we're talking about, it gives us a way of kind of building a tower of consequences of things. So if we're just saying, well, let's talk about it in natural language, it doesn't really give us some hard foundation that lets us, build step by step to work something out. I mean, it's kind of like what happens in math. If we were just sort of vaguely taught, but didn't have the kind of full structure of math and all that kind of thing, we wouldn't be able to build this kind of big tower of consequences. And so, in a sense, what we're trying to do with the whole computational language effort is to make a formalism for describing the world that makes it possible to kind of build this tower of consequences.
Well, can you talk about this dance between natural language and Wolfram language? So there's this gigantic net where people post memes and diary type thoughts and very important sounding articles, and I'll ask a question. What is the capital of some
Yeah, right.
country?
And it turns into, what's the distance between, Chicago and London or
Yeah.
something? And that will turn into, geodistance of entity, city, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of those things is very well defined. We know, given that it's the entity, city, Chicago, et cetera, Illinois, United States, we know the geolocation of that, we know its population, we know all kinds of things about it,
Hmm.
which we have, curated that data to be able to know that with some degree of certainty, so to speak.
Hmm.
And then we can compute things from this, and that's kind of the yeah, that's the idea.
But then, something like GPT, large language models, do they allow you to make that conversion much more powerful?
Okay, so that's an interesting thing, which we still don't know everything about.
Mhm.
Okay, I mean, this question of going from natural language to computational language
Yes.
in Wolfram Alpha, we've now, Wolfram Alpha's been out and about for what, 13 and a half years now, and we've achieved, I don't know what it is, 98%, 99% success on queries that get put into it. Now, obviously, there's a sort of feedback loop because the things that work are things people go on putting into it. So
Yeah.
but we've got to a very high success rate of the little fragments of natural language that people put in, questions, math calculations, chemistry calculations, whatever it is. We do very well at that, turning those things into computational language. Now, from the very beginning of Wolfram Alpha, I thought about, for example, writing code with natural language. In fact, I was just looking at this recently. I had a post that I wrote in 2010, 2011 called something like Programming with Natural Language is Actually Going to Work.
Hmm.
Okay. And so, we had done a bunch of experiments using methods that were a little bit, some of them a little bit machine learning like, but certainly not the same kind of idea of vast training data and so on
Hmm.
that is the story of large language models. Actually, I know that post, a piece of utter trivia, but that post, Steve Jobs forwarded that post around to all kinds of people at Apple,
Hmm.
and who know programming languages. So he was very happy to see the idea that you could get rid of this kind of layer of kind of engineering like structure. He would have liked, I think what's happening now, because it really is the case that you can, this idea that you have to kind of learn how the computer works to use a programming language is something that is, I think, a thing that, just like you had to learn the details of the opcodes to know how assembly language worked and so on. It's kind of a thing that's a limited time.
Language
Right.
dialogue. It's like multiple queries kind of thing.
Yeah, right. There's so many things that are really interesting
Yeah.
that work and so on. So first thing is, can you just walk up to the computer and expect to sort of specify a computation? What one realizes is humans have to have some idea of kind of this way of thinking about things computationally.
Hmm.
Without that, you're kind of out of luck because you just have no idea what you're going to walk up to a computer. I remember when I should tell a silly story about myself. The very first computer I saw,
Hmm.
which was when I was 10 years old, and it was a big mainframe, what computers did. And it's like somebody was showing me this computer, and it's like, can the computer work out the weight of a dinosaur, of what computation is about? I think it's a very, for education, that is the key thing. Is kind of this this notion, not computer science, not so the details of programming, but just this idea of how do you think about the world computationally. Computation, thinking about the world computationally, is kind of this formal way of thinking about the world. We've had other ones, like logic was a formal way, is a way of sort of abstracting and formalizing some aspects of the world. Mathematics is another one. Computation is this very broad way of sort of formalizing the way we think about the world. And the thing that's cool about computation is if we can successfully formalize things in terms of computation, computers can help us figure out what the consequences are. It's not like you formalized it with math. Well, that's nice, but now you have to, if you're not using a computer to do the math, you have to go work out a bunch of stuff yourself. So I think, but this idea, let's see, I mean, we're trying to take kind of we're talking about sort of natural language and its relationship to computational language, the sort of the typical computational terms. Then it does pretty well at synthesizing Wolfram language code, and it'll probably do better in the future because we've got a huge number of examples of natural language input together with the Wolfram language translation of that.
Hmm.
So it's kind of that's a thing where you can kind of extrapolating from all those examples makes it easier to do that task.
Is the prompter task code also kind of debugging the Wolfram language code, or is your hope to not do that
Oh
debugging?
no, no, no. I mean, so there are many steps here. Okay,
Yeah.
so the first thing is you type natural language. It generates Wolfram language
Do you have
code.
examples, by the way? Do you have an example that is it the dinosaur example? Do you have an example that jumps to mind that we should be thinking about? Some dumb example.
It's like take my heart rate data
Hmm.
and figure out whether I make a moving average every 7 days or something, and work out what the and make a plot of the result.
Mhm,
Okay, so that's a thing which is about two-thirds of a line of Wolfram language code.
mhm,
I mean, it's list plot of moving average of some data bin or something of the data,
mhm,
and then you'll get the result. And the vague thing that I was just saying in natural language could would almost certainly correctly turn into that very simple piece of Wolfram language code.
mhm. So
But
you start mumbling about heart rate,
yeah,
and that kinda, you arrive at the moving average kind of idea.
right, you say average over 7 days. Maybe it'll figure out that that's a moving, that
Yeah.
that can be encapsulated as this moving average idea. I'm not sure. But then the typical workflow that I'm seeing is you generate this piece of Wolfram language code. It's pretty small usually. And if it isn't small, it probably isn't right. But if it's pretty small, and Wolfram language is one of the ideas of Wolfram language is it's a language that humans can read. It's not a language which programming languages tend to be this one-way story of humans write them and computers execute from them. Wolfram language is intended to be something which is sort of like math notation, something where humans write it and humans are supposed to read it as well. And so, kind of the workflow that's emerging is kind of this human mumbles some things, you know, large language model produces a fragment of Wolfram language code, then you look at that, you say, yeah, that looks well. Typically, you just run it first. You see, does it produce the right thing? You look at what it produces, you might say that's obviously crazy. You look at the code, you see, I see why it's crazy. You fix it. If you really care about the result and you really want to make sure it's right, you better look at that code and understand it, because that's the way you have this sort of checkpoint of, did it really do what I expected it to do? Now, you go beyond that. I mean, it's what we find is, for example, let's say the code does the wrong thing.
Mhm.
Then you can often say to the large language model, can you adjust this to do this? And it's pretty good at doing that.
Interesting. So you're using the output of the code to give you hints about the function of the code. So you're debugging on
Yes.
based on the output of the
And
code,
by the
not the
way,
code itself.
right, the plugin that we have, for ChatGPT, it does that routinely. It will send the thing in, it will get a result, it will discover, the LLM will discover itself that the result is not plausible,
Mhm.
and it will go back and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, it's very polite," and it goes back and says, "I'll rewrite that piece of code," and then it will try it again and get the result. The other thing that's pretty interesting is when you're just running. So one of the new concepts that we invented this whole idea of notebooks back 36 years ago now.
Mhm.
And so now there's the question of sort of how do you combine this idea of notebooks where you have, text and code and output? How do you combine that with the notion of chat and so on? And there's some really interesting things there. Like, for example, a very typical thing now is we have these notebooks where as soon as the if the thing produces errors, if the run this code and it produces messages and so on, the the LLM automatically not only looks at those messages, it can also see all kinds of internal information about stack traces and things like this. And it does a remarkably good job of guessing what's wrong and telling you. So in other words, it's looking at things. It's sort of interesting. It's kind of a typical sort of AI-ish thing that it's able to have more sensory data than we humans are able to have, because it's able to look at a bunch of stuff that we humans would kind of glaze over looking at, and it's able to then come up with, oh, this is the explanation of what's happening.
And what is the data? The stack trace, the code you've written previously, the natural language you've written
Yeah,
previously.
it's also what's happening is one of the things that's is, for example, when there's these messages, there's documentation about these messages, there's examples of where the messages have occurred otherwise,
Nice.
all these kinds of things. The other thing that's really amusing
Yeah.
with this is when it makes a mistake. One of the things that's in our prompt when the code doesn't work is read the documentation. And we have another piece of the plugin that
Yeah.
lets it read documentation, and that again is very, very useful, because it will it will figure out. Sometimes it'll make up the name of some option for some function that doesn't really exist. Read the documentation. It'll have some wrong structure for the function and so on. It's That's a powerful thing. I mean, the thing that I've realized is we built this language over the course of all these years to be nice and coherent and consistent and so on. So it's easy for humans to understand. Turns out there was a side effect that I didn't anticipate, which is it makes it easier for AIs to understand.
So it's almost like another natural language. But
Yeah,
so
yeah,
Wolfram language is a kind of foreign language.
yes,
So
yes,
you have a lineup: English, French, Japanese, Wolfram
yeah.
language, and then I don't know, Spanish, and then the
And
system is not going to notice. Hopefully.
well, yes. I mean, maybe. That's an interesting question because it really depends on what I see as being an important piece of fundamental science that basically just jumped out at us with ChatGPT. Because I think the real question is, why does ChatGPT work? How is it possible to encapsulate, to successfully reproduce all these kinds of things in natural language, um, you know, with a comparatively small, he says, couple of 100 billion, weights of neural net and so on. And I think that that relates to kind of a fundamental fact about language, which the main thing is that I think there's a structure to language that we haven't kind of really explored very well. It's kind of this semantic grammar I'm talking about language. I mean, we kind of know that when we set up human language, we know that it has certain regularities. We know that it has a certain grammatical structure. Noun followed by verb, followed by noun, adjectives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's its kind of grammatical structure. But I think the thing that ChatGPT is showing us is that there's an additional kind of regularity to language, which has to do with the meaning of the language beyond just this pure, part of speech combination type of thing. And I think the kind of the one example of that we've had in the past is logic. And I think my sort of kind of picture of how was logic invented, how was logic discovered, it really was a thing that was discovered in its original conception. It was discovered presumably by Aristotle, who kind of listened to a bunch of people, orators, giving speeches, and this one made sense, that one doesn't make sense. This one, and you see these patterns of, if the I don't know what, if the Persians do this, then the this does that,
Mhm.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what Aristotle realized is there's a structure to those sentences, there's a structure to that rhetoric that doesn't matter whether it's the Persians and the Greeks or whether it's the cats and the dogs.
Mhm.
It's just, P and Q. You can abstract from the details of these particular sentences. You can lift out this kind of formal structure, and that's what logic is.
That's a heck of a discovery, by the way. Logic. You're making me realize now.
Yeah,
It's not obvious.
the fact that there is an abstraction from natural language that has where you can fill in any word you want
Yeah.
is a very interesting discovery. Now, it took a long time to mature. I mean, Aristotle had this idea of syllogistic logic, where there were these, so to speak. And it took until 1830, with George Boole, to kind of get beyond that and kind of see that there was a level of abstraction that was beyond this particular template of a sentence, so to speak. And that's, what's interesting there is, in a sense, you know, G, ChatGPT is operating at the Aristotelian level. It's essentially dealing with templates of sentences. By the time you get to Boole and Boolean algebra and this idea of, you can have arbitrary depth nested collections of ands and ors and knots, and you can nested collections of ands and ors and knots, and you can resolve what they mean. Um, that's you've gone beyond the pure sort of templates of natural language to something which is an arbitrarily deep computation. But the thing that I think we realize from ChatGPT is, Aristotle stopped too quickly,
Mhm.
and there was more that you could have lifted out of language as formal structures. And I think there's, in a sense, we've captured some of that in some of what is in language. There, there's a there's a lot of kind of little calculi, little algebras. There's a lot of kind of little calculi, little algebras of what you can say, what language talks about. I mean, whether it's, I don't know, if you say, if you go from place A to place B to place C, it doesn't matter how you went. Like logic, it doesn't matter whether you flew there, walked there, swam there, whatever. You still, this transitivity of where you go is still valid. And there are many kinds of features, I think, of the way the world works, that are captured in these aspects of language, so to speak. And I think what ChatGPT effectively has found, just like it discovered logic, people are really surprised it can do these logical inferences. It discovered logic the same way Aristotle discovered logic, by looking at a lot of sentences effectively and noticing the patterns in those sentences.
But it feels like it's discovering something much more complicated than logic. So this kind of semantic grammar, I think you wrote about this. Maybe we can call it the laws of language, I believe you call, or which I like, the laws of thought.
Yes, that was the title that George Boole had for his Boolean algebra back in 1830. But yes,
Laws of thought?
yes, that was what he said.
Whew.
So,
All right.
so he thought he nailed it with Boolean algebra.
Yeah.
There's more to it.
And it's a good question. How much more is
Right.
there to it? And it seems like one of the reasons, as you imply, that the reason GPT works, Chat GPT works, is that there's a finite number of things to it.
Yeah, I mean
Like it's discovering the laws. In some sense, GPT is discovering the laws of semantic grammar that underlies language.
yes. And what's sort of interesting is, in the computational universe, there's a lot of other kinds of computation that you could do.
Mhm.
They're just not ones that we humans have cared about and operate with. And that's probably because our brains are built in a certain way. And the neural nets of our brains are not that different in some sense from the neural nets of a large language model. And that's kind of and so when we think about, and maybe we can talk about this some more, but when we think about sort of what will AIs ultimately do, the answer is, insofar as AIs are just doing computation, they can run off and do all these kinds of crazy computations. But the ones that we sort of have decided we care about is this kind of very limited set.
That's where the reinforcement learning with human feedback seems to come in. The more the AI say the stuff that kind of interests us, the more we're impressed by it. So it can do a lot of interesting, intelligent things, but we're only interested in the AI systems when they communicate human in a human-like way
Yes.
about human-like topics.
Yes. Well, it's like technology. I mean, in a sense, the physical world provides all kinds of things. There are all kinds of processes going on in physics. Only a limited set of those are ones that we capture and use for technology, because they're only a limited set where we say, this is a thing that we can sort of apply to the human purposes we currently care about. I mean, you might have said, okay, you pick up a piece of rock. You say, okay, there's a nice silicate. It contains all kinds of silicon. I don't care. Then you realize, oh, we could actually turn this into a semiconductor wafer and make a microprocessor out of it, and then we care a lot about it.
Yes.
And it's this thing about what do we, in the evolution of our civilization, what things do we identify as being things we care about? I mean, it's like, when there was a little announcement recently of the possibility of a high temperature superconductor
Mhm.
that involved, the element lutetium, which generally nobody has cared about.
Yes.
And it's kind of but suddenly, if there's this application that relates to kind of human purposes, we start to care a lot.
So, given your thinking that GPT may have discovered inklings of laws of thought, do you think such laws exist? Can we linger on that? Do you-
Yeah.
what's your intuition here?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the fact is, look, the logic is but the first step. There are many other kinds of calculi about things that we consider, about sort of things that happen in the world or things that are meaningful.
Well, how do you know logic is not the last step? You know what I mean? So,
Well,
like, what?
because we can plainly see that they're things. I mean, if you say, here's a sentence that is syntactically correct, okay? You look at it and you're like, the happy electron, you know, ate, I don't know what, something that you look at it and it's like, this is meaningless. It's just a bunch of words. It's syntactically correct. The nouns and the verbs are in the right place, but it just doesn't mean anything. Um, and so there clearly is some rule, that there are rules that determine when a sentence has the potential to be meaningful, that go beyond the pure parts of speech syntax. And so the question is, what are those rules? And are there a fairly finite set of those rules? My guess is that there's a fairly finite set of those rules. And once you have those rules, you have a kind of a construction kit, just like the rules of syntactic grammar give you a construction kit for making syntactically correct sentences. So you can also have a construction kit for making semantically correct sentences. Those sentences may not be realized in the world. I mean, I think, the elephant flew to the moon.
Yeah.
A semantically, we have an idea. If I say that to you, you kind of know what that means. But the fact is, it hasn't been realized in the world, so to speak.
So semantically correct, perhaps, is things that can be imagined with the human mind. No, things that are consistent with both our imagination and our understanding of physical reality. I don't know
Yeah, it's a
what
good question. I mean,
what
it's a good
semantically
question.
correct means.
It's a good question. I mean, I think it is given the way we have constructed language, it is things which fit with the things we're describing in language. It's a bit circular in the end, because you can and the sort of boundaries of what is physically realizable. Okay, let's take the example of motion.
Mhm,
Okay, motion is a complicated concept. It might seem like it's a concept that should have been figured out by the Greeks, long ago, but it's actually a really pretty complicated concept. Because what is motion? Motion is you can go from place A to place B, and it's still you when you get to the other end,
mhm.
right? You take an object, you move it, and it's still the same object, but it's in a different place. Now, even in ordinary physics, that doesn't always work that way. If you're near a space-time singularity in a black hole, for example, and you take your teapot or something, you don't have much of a teapot by the time it's near the space-time singularity. It's been completely, deformed beyond recognition. But so that's a case where pure motion doesn't really work.
Mhm.
You can't have a thing stay the same. But so this idea of motion is something that sort of is a slightly complicated idea. But once you have the idea of motion, you can start. Once you have the idea that you're going to describe things as being the same thing but in a different place, that sort of abstracted idea then has that has all sorts of consequences, like this transitivity of motion. Go from A to B, B to C. You've gone from A to C. And that's so at that level of description, you can have what are sort of inevitable consequences. They're inevitable features of the way you've sort of set things up. And that's, I think, what this sort of semantic grammar is capturing, is things like that. And I think that it's a question of, what does the word mean when you say I move from here to there. Well, it's complicated to say what that means. This is this whole issue of, is pure motion possible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But once you have kind of got an idea of what that means, then there are inevitable consequences of that idea.
But the very idea of meaning, it seems like there's some words that become, um, it's like there's a latent ambiguity to them. I mean, it's the word like emotionally loaded words like hate and love.
Right.
It's like what do they
Well,
mean exactly? So especially when you have relationships between complicated objects, we seem to take this kind of shortcut, descriptive shortcut to describe like
right.
object A hates object B. What's that really mean?
Right. Well, words are defined by kind of our social use of them. I mean,
Sure.
it's not, a word in computational language, for example, when we say we have a construct there, we expect that that construct is a building block from which we can construct an arbitrarily tall tower. So
Mhm,
we have to have a very solid building block. And we have to, it turns into a piece of code, it has documentation, it's a whole thing.
mhm.
But the word hate, the documentation for that word, well, there isn't a standard documentation for that word, so to speak. It's a complicated thing defined by kind of how we use it. When, if it wasn't for the fact that we were using language, I mean, so what is language at some level? Language is a way of packaging thoughts so that we can communicate them to another mind.
Can these complicated words be converted into something that a computation engine can use?
Right. So I think the answer to that is that what one can do in computational language is make a specific definition. And if you have a complicated word, like let's say the word eat, okay? You'd think that's a simple word. It's, animals eat things, whatever else. But, you do programming, you say this function eats arguments.
Mhm.
which is sort of poetically similar
Hmm.
to the animal eating things. But if you start to say, well, what are the implications of the function eating something? Does it can the function be poisoned? Well, maybe it can actually, but if there's a type mismatch or something in some language, but in what how far does that analogy go? And it's just an analogy.
Yeah.
Whereas if you use the word eat in a computational language level, you would define there isn't a thing which you anchor to the kind of natural language concept eat, but it
Yeah.
is now some precise definition of that then you can compute things from.
But don't you think the analogy is also precise? Software eats the world. Don't you think there is something concrete in terms of meaning about analogies?
Sure. But the thing that sort of is the first target for computational language is to take sort of the ordinary meaning of things and try and make it precise. Make it
Yep.
sufficiently precise, you can build these towers of computation on top of it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like if you start with a piece of poetry and you say, I'm going to define my program with this piece of poetry,
Hmm.
it's kind of like that's a difficult thing. It's better to say I'm going to just have this boring piece of prose and it's using words in the ordinary way,
Yeah.
and that's how I'm communicating with my computer, and that's how I'm going to build this solid building block from which I can construct this whole kind of computational tower.
So there's some sense where if you take a poem and reduce it to something computable, you're going to have very few things left. So maybe there's a bunch of human interaction that's just poetic, aimless nonsense.
Well,
That's just like recreational, like hamster in a wheel. It's not actually producing anything.
well, I think that that's a complicated thing because, in a sense, human linguistic communication is there's one mind, it's producing language, that language is having an effect on another mind.
Yeah.
And the question of there's sort of a type of effect that is well defined, let's say, where for example it's very independent of the two minds. That it doesn't, there's communication where it can matter a lot, sort of what the experience of one mind is versus another one, and so on.
Yeah, but what is the purpose of natural language communication? Can,
Well, I think the
versus so computational language somehow feels more amenable to the definition of purpose. It's like, yeah, you're given two clean representations of a concept and you can build a tower based on that. Is
right.
is is natural language the same thing but more fuzzy? Or what?
Well, I think the story of natural language, right, and that's the great invention of our species. We don't know whether it exists in other species, but we know it exists in our species. It's the thing that allows you to sort of communicate abstractly from like one generation of the species to another. You can, there is an abstract version of knowledge that can be passed down. It doesn't have to be, genetics. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to apprentice the next species, the next generation of birds to the previous one to show them how something works.
Yeah.
There is this abstracted version of knowledge that can be kind of passed down. Now, that, it still tends to rely because language is fuzzy. It does tend to rely on the fact that, if we look at some ancient language that where we don't have a chain of translations from it until what we have today, we may not understand that ancient language. And we may not understand, its concepts may be different from the ones that we have today. We still have to have something of a chain, but it is something where we can realistically expect to communicate abstract ideas. And that's one of the big roles of a language. I think, in uh, it's and that's been this ability to sort of concretify abstract things is what language has provided.
Do you see natural language and thought as the same? The stuff that's going on inside your mind?
Well, that's been a long debate in philosophy,
It seems to become more important now when we think about how intelligent GPT is.
whatever
That
that
this,
means.
whatever that means, but it seems like the stuff that's going on in the human mind seems something like intelligence. And
Yes.
his language,
Well, we call it intelligence.
yeah, we call, well, yes.
The
And so you start to think of, okay, what's the relationship between thought, the language of thought, the laws of
right.
then words like reasoning, and the laws of language, and how that has to do with computation. which
Right.
seems like more rigorous, precise ways of reasoning
Right. Which are beyond human. I mean,
beyond
much of
human.
what computers do, humans do not do. I mean, you might say,
Humans are a subset,
yes,
presumably,
yes,
hopefully.
yes, yes, right. You might say, who needs computation when we have large language models? Large language models can just, eventually you'll have a big enough neural net, it can do anything.
Mhm.
But they're really doing the kinds of things that humans quickly do. And there are plenty of sort of formal things that humans never quickly do. For example, I don't know, some people can do mental arithmetic. They can do a certain amount of math in their minds. I don't think many people can run a program in their minds of any sophistication.
Mhm.
It's just not something people do. It's not something people have even thought of doing because it's kind of not, you can easily run it on a computer.
When an arbitrary program,
Yeah.
aren't we running specialized programs?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But if I say to you,
Run this
here's a
program.
Turing machine,
Yeah.
tell me what it does after 50 steps. And you're like trying to think about that in your mind. That's really hard to do. It's not what people do. I mean,
Well, in some sense, people program, they build a computer, they program it just to answer your question about what the system does after 50 steps. I mean, humans build computers.
yes. Yes, yes,
So,
that's right. But they've created something which is then when they run it, it's doing something different than what's happening in their minds. I mean, they've outsourced that that piece of computation from something that is internally happening in their minds to something that is now a tool that's external to their minds.
so by the way, humans to you didn't invent computers, they discovered them,
They discovered computation. They
which
invented the technology of computers.
the computer is just a kind of way to plug into this whole the stream of computation. There's
Yes.
probably other ways. There's
Well,
probably a
for
lot of
sure. I
ways.
mean, the particular ways that we make computers out of semiconductors and electronics and so on, that's the particular technology stack we built. I mean, the story of a lot of what people try to do with quantum computing is finding different sort of underlying physical, infrastructure for doing computation. Biology does lots of computation. It does it using an infrastructure that's different from semiconductors and electronics.
Mhm.
It's a molecular scale sort of computational process that hopefully we'll understand more about. I have some ideas about understanding more about that, but that's another it's another representation of computation. Things that happen in the physical universe at the level of these evolving hypergraphs and so on. That's another sort of implementation layer for this abstract idea of computation.
So if GPT or large language models are starting to develop or implicitly understand the laws of language and thought.